Almeida's face, previously red with fury, drained of color, turning pale as wax. His wide eyes fixed on the badge, and cold sweat began to trickle down his forehead. The murmur of the square ceased, and all eyes were fixed on the sergeant who, minutes before, felt untouchable, and now trembled before the calm and relentless Inspector General. The law, after all, had eyes and ears everywhere. The badge, now visible under the incipient dawn light, was not just an emblem of authority. It was a mirror reflecting Almeida's distorted image, a man who, in a matter of seconds, saw his world collapse. The cold sweat running down his forehead was not just from nervousness, but from a chilling terror that pierced him to the bone. That emblem, engraved with the insignia of the General Internal Affairs Command of the Military Police, and the name, the name, Commander General Valeria Santiago. The woman he had just threatened, surrounded, tried to handcuff for contempt, was the highest-ranking officer in the corporation, the Commander General herself. The military magistrate he knew was on her way to investigate the complaints that had haunted him for months. The air in the square became dense, heavy, almost unbreathable. The silence was so absolute that Almeida's erratic heart seemed to echo in the early morning. His eyes, previously full of uncontrolled fury, now danced between the badge and Valeria's serene face, a face that radiated a deadly calm. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, scratching. The handcuffs in his hand, once a symbol of his arbitrary power, now seemed to burn, an unbearable weight. Valeria, without moving a muscle, merely held his gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, only an iron determination, an unquestionable authority that needed no shouts or threats. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was a whisper that paradoxically resonated like thunder in the quiet of the early morning. "Sergeant Almeida," she began, her voice low and controlled, but laden with a weight that made the sergeant's body tremble uncontrollably. "You were about to handcuff a superior officer for contempt. Could you explain to me, in detail, what led you to such a decision?" Almeida tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, turning into a pathetic choke. He opened and closed his mouth, his eyes wide, searching for an escape, an excuse, anything that could mitigate the impending catastrophe. The other officers, previously silent accomplices or passive spectators of his arbitrary acts, now cowered, avoiding the Commander General's gaze, as if fearing to be struck by the same wave of condemnation. They knew. Everyone knew of Almeida's farce, of the abuses, of the veiled corruption. And now justice had arrived, personified in the woman he had underestimated. "The handcuffs, Sergeant," Valeria continued, her gaze fixed on Almeida's trembling hands. "They are for justice, not for intimidation. And the contempt, the true contempt, Almeida, is what you have done to this uniform, to this corporation, and above all to the citizens we swore to protect." With each word, Almeida felt smaller, more insignificant. The arrogance that had inflated him minutes before had evaporated, replaced by a nauseating emptiness. He felt the weight of the other officers' gazes on him, no longer with fear, but with a mixture of shock and perhaps discreet relief. The farce was over. Valeria took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Her eyes, previously just firm, now carried a hint of disappointment and seriousness that was sharper than any blade. "I came here, Sergeant Almeida, to investigate the countless complaints of abuse of power, extortion, and improper conduct concerning this battalion, and specifically you. I came to end your farce, as you called it. And what do I find? A sergeant who, instead of doing his duty, tries to silence the Commander General herself. The public revelation of her mission, spoken with such clarity and authority, sealed Almeida's fate. There was no longer any way to deny, to disguise. The murmur, which had ceased, now resumed, but in low tones, shocked whispers. The civilians watching from afar, previously fearful, now seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, some even with a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "Sergeant Almeida," Valeria ordered, her voice gaining an intensity that left no room for questioning. "Release the handcuffs and hand over your weapon. You are under formal investigation. And from this moment, suspended from your duties." The order was clear, undeniable. Almeida felt his blood run cold. His hand, still holding the handcuffs, trembled so much that the metal rattled. He looked at the weapon in his holster, his last vestige of power, and then at Valeria's unwavering face. The battle was lost. The law, which he thought he manipulated, had turned against him, personified in the woman he had dared to challenge in the darkness of the early morning. Commander General Valeria Santiago was not just the law, she was the storm he had invoked. Valeria's order echoed in the early morning, sharper than any shout, more definitive than any verdict. Almeida felt the air thin in his lungs, his heart beating erratically against his ribs, a drum of panic. His hand, once so firm in wielding power, now trembled uncontrollably, the handcuffs rattling like shackles that already bound him. He looked at the cold metal, then at the weapon in his holster, symbols of an authority that slipped away like sand through his fingers. Valeria's image, serene and relentless, was the personification of the justice he had mocked. With a sigh that seemed to tear his throat, Almeida obeyed. The metallic sound of the handcuffs falling on the stone pavement broke the oppressive silence, a dry, final noise that sealed his fate. The echo of that sound reverberated in the square, an epitaph for his arrogance. Then with slow, clumsy movements he unholstered his weapon. The gun, an extension of his power for so many years, now seemed a dead weight. A strange and meaningless object in his trembling hands. He held it out, the grip towards Valeria, his eyes downcast, unable to meet the Commander General's gaze. The humiliation was palpable, a heavy cloak enveloping him. Valeria took the weapon with the same calm with which she had revealed her badge. Her fingers wrapped around the grip with a certainty that contrasted with Almeida's fragility. She did not put it away. She merely held it for a moment, as if weighing the burden of responsibility that came with it. Her eyes swept over the other officers, who remained in a rigid and uncomfortable posture, avoiding any eye contact, but absorbing every detail of the scene. They were witnesses not only to the fall of a man, but to the beginning of a new era of order. "Sergeant Almeida," Valeria's voice broke the silence again, this time with a calculated coldness that left no room for doubt. "You will be escorted to the battalion. There you will surrender your badge and all your corporation belongings. You will be formally notified of your suspension and the charges against you. An administrative and criminal process will be initiated immediately." She then turned to the group of officers watching. Her gaze, previously focused on Almeida, now widened to encompass all of them, a sweep that seemed to penetrate the soul of each one. "Who is the most senior officer present besides Sergeant Almeida?" A young lieutenant, pale and visibly nervous, stepped forward. "I am Lieutenant Ribeiro, Commander General. I am the officer on duty tonight." Valeria nodded without averting her gaze. "Lieutenant Ribeiro, you and 2 of your men will escort Sergeant Almeida. Ensure that he has no contact with anyone and that all procedures are followed strictly. He is in custody, and any attempt at obstruction will be dealt with the utmost severity." Ribeiro swallowed hard, but the determination in his eyes was evident. This was a turning point, and he knew his response would define his future. "Yes, Commander General, understood. Sergeant Almeida, please accompany us." 2 other officers, visibly relieved to have a clear order and to distance themselves from the aura of condemnation that hung over Almeida, approached. They did not use force, but their presence was undeniable. Almeida, with hunched shoulders, seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. He did not resist, merely allowed himself to be guided, a ghost of his former self. the arrogance and power that had inflated him completely shattered. The murmur among the civilians, previously contained, now rose in whispers of relief and even discreet celebration. The early morning, which began with Almeida's oppression, ended with the promise of justice. Valeria watched as Almeida was led away, his figure diminishing in the gloom that was beginning to give way to daylight. She felt the weight of the weapon in her hand, a reminder of the power that had been abused and the duty that now fell upon her. Almeida's farce had come to an end, but the real battle, that of restoring the corporation's trust and integrity, was just beginning. She turned to Lieutenant Ribeiro, who was still standing, awaiting further orders. "Lieutenant Ribeiro," she said, her voice now a little softer, but still authoritative, "gather all officers and enlisted personnel on duty. I want an immediate meeting in the battalion auditorium and prepare a detailed report of all occurrences tonight, including this incident. From now on, the Inspector General's office assumes command of operations in this battalion." The dawn painted the sky with shades of purple and orange, and the light spreading across the square revealed the dirt and neglect that Almeida had allowed. But under the new light, there was also new hope. Commander General Valeria Santiago, the military magistrate who came to end the farce, was there, and her presence promised a deep cleansing. The silence of the early morning had been broken, and justice, finally, was beginning to speak. The early morning, which had witnessed the fall of a tyrant, now began to give way to the incipient light of dawn. The shades of purple and orange painting the sky were not just colors. They were the promise of a new day, but also a reminder that the darkness of the night still clung to the corners, waiting to be dispelled. Commander General Valeria Santiago, with Almeida's weapon still in her hand, watched Lieutenant Ribeiro gather the remaining officers and enlisted personnel. The murmur among the civilians, previously a whisper of relief, now transformed into a silent, almost reverent expectation. They did not know what would come next, but Valeria's presence radiated a certainty they had long lacked. Valeria felt the weight of responsibility, not only of the weapon in her hand, but of the corporation that now looked at her with a mixture of apprehension and perhaps hesitant hope. Almeida's farce had been dismantled, but the structure that allowed it to thrive was still standing. The real battle was just beginning. She handed the weapon to one of the officers accompanying Ribeiro with a firm, wordless gesture, and then turned to the lieutenant. "Lieutenant Ribeiro," her voice echoed, now without the urgency of confrontation, but with unshakable authority. "Ensure that all officers and enlisted personnel on duty, including those who were off duty and called in, are in the auditorium in 30 minutes. I want an accurate count, and prepare a recording system for the meeting. Every word will be documented." Ribeiro, who seemed to have found new vigor, nodded emphatically. "Yes, Commander General, it will be done." As the officers dispersed, Valeria remained for a moment in the square, her eyes scanning the scene. The dirt, the graffiti on the walls, the precarious lighting, everything spoke of a neglect that went beyond infrastructure. It was a reflection of the soul of that battalion, corroded by negligence and corruption. The deep cleansing she had promised would not only be of people, but of a system, of a culture. On the way to the battalion, the silence in the car was dense. Valeria observed the city beginning to awaken, the first lights turning on in the windows, the first sounds of a new day. But in her mind, the echoes of the night still resonated. Almeida's arrogance, the fear in the eyes of the civilians, the silent complicity of the officers. The Inspector General's office had received countless complaints, but seeing the extent of the problem firsthand was another thing. Upon arriving at the battalion, the atmosphere was charged. The officers moved with a new seriousness, their gazes meeting Valeria's with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The auditorium, a space usually used for routine instructions and bureaucracy, now transformed into an improvised tribunal, a stage for the redefinition of their mission. When Valeria entered, the murmur ceased abruptly, all eyes fixed on her. She did not go onto the stage. She preferred to stay at the same level as the others, a subtle strategy to emphasize that, although she was the highest authority, she was there to speak with them, not to speak about them from a distant pulpit. Lieutenant Ribeiro stood beside her, pale, but with a posture denoting respect and readiness. Valeria waited for the silence to be absolute, for every breath to be held. Her eyes swept the auditorium, meeting the gaze of each one, unhurriedly, without immediate judgment, but with an intensity that penetrated. "Good morning, officers and enlisted personnel," she began, her voice calm, but with a resonance that filled the space. "I am Commander General Valeria Santiago, and as many of you already know, I did not come here for a courtesy visit." A wave of almost inaudible murmurs swept through the room, quickly stifled by Valeria's firm gaze. "I came here," she continued, her voice gaining a strength that needed no shouts, "because this battalion, this uniform, and above all, the citizens you swore to protect, have been dishonored. The complaints that reached the Inspector General's office are serious: abuse of power, extortion, improper conduct, and a culture of silence that allowed all this to prosper." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The silence was so dense that one could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. "What happened this early morning in the square," Valeria proceeded, "with Sergeant Almeida, was just the tip of the iceberg, and it was, for me, conclusive proof that the farce he tried to maintain, and which many of you, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of convenience, allowed, has come to an end. There will be no more farce in this battalion. There will be no more impunity." Her eyes fixed on a point at the back of the room, but her message was for everyone. "As of today, the Inspector General's office assumes command of operations. Each of you will be investigated. Every complaint will be scrutinized, and those who engaged in acts of corruption or abuse, or who were silent accomplices, will face the most severe consequences of military and civil law." A palpable tension filled the air. Some officers lowered their eyes, others exchanged nervous glances. The fear, previously focused on Almeida, now had a new target: Valeria's relentless justice. "However," Valeria continued, her voice softening slightly but without losing its firmness, "I also know that many of you joined this corporation with ideals, with the desire to serve and protect. I know that many were forced to remain silent, to look away. For those, there is a chance for redemption, for rebuilding. From now on, the door of the Inspector General's office will be open to anyone who has information about irregularities, about abuses, about the corruption that has stained this uniform." She looked directly at Lieutenant Ribeiro. "Lieutenant, you will be the initial point of contact, and I assure all of you, confidentiality will be absolute. Those who cooperate and help clean up this corporation will be protected. Those who try to obstruct, lie, or retaliate will face the full weight of my authority." Valeria took a step forward, her figure imposing even without a podium. "This is not a threat. It is a promise that justice will be restored, a promise that the integrity of this corporation will be rebuilt, brick by brick. It will be a painful but necessary process, and I will be here every step of the way to ensure it is fulfilled." The dawn light finally streamed through the auditorium windows, revealing the tense and thoughtful faces of the officers. Almeida's farce had ended, but the true battle for the soul of the battalion was just beginning, and Commander General Valeria Santiago was ready to lead it. The silence that followed Commander General Valeria Santiago's words was not one of immediate comprehension, but of paralyzing shock. It was as if the air had been sucked from the auditorium, leaving behind only the gravity of her promises and threats. The officers' faces, previously merely tense, now displayed a range of emotions: fear, suppressed anger, resignation, and in some, a glimpse of relief, as if an invisible weight had finally been acknowledged. Valeria did not move, allowing the impact of her words to solidify. Her eyes, which had swept the room with an almost surgical intensity, now rested on Lieutenant Ribeiro. He, in turn, was pale, but his posture, previously hesitant, now seemed more erect, as if the responsibility just placed on his shoulders had forced him to grow. "Lieutenant Ribeiro?" Valeria's voice broke the silence again, this time with a more direct tone. "Your first task is to ensure that the recording of this meeting is immediately archived and a copy sent to the Inspector General's office. Next, I want you to establish a secure and confidential communication channel. A phone, an email, a physical location, whatever is necessary for any officer or enlisted personnel to come forward and provide information without fear of retaliation. This channel must be publicized to everyone, with an explicit guarantee of protection." Ribeiro nodded, a lump in his throat. "Yes, Commander General, it will be done immediately." "And furthermore," Valeria continued, her voice becoming a little colder, "from now on, all operations of this battalion will be under the direct supervision of the Inspector General's office. No patrol, no approach, no investigation will be initiated without the approval of an Inspector General's officer who will be assigned to this battalion. I myself will lead this transition in the first few days. I want detailed reports of all activities daily, without exception. The era of unrestricted autonomy and impunity is over." She made a subtle gesture with her head, indicating that the meeting was adjourned. The murmur, previously muffled, began to rise, but it was a murmur of uncertainty, not defiance. The officers began to stand, some hurrying to the exit, others lingering, exchanging furtive glances. The Commander General observed each of them, memorizing faces, postures, reactions. She knew that the real war would not be fought with weapons, but with information, loyalties, and the breaking of a system of silence. As the auditorium emptied, Valeria turned to Ribeiro. "Lieutenant, I need a room, a temporary office with access to all battalion files and systems, and I want the Inspector General's team to start arriving in a few hours. They will bring the necessary equipment for forensic investigation of all records." Ribeiro, visibly overwhelmed but determined, responded, "Yes, Commander. The former commander's office is available and is already being prepared. As for the files, I will do what I can to expedite access." Valeria noticed the hesitation in his voice when he mentioned the files. "What does what I can mean, Lieutenant?" Her voice was not accusatory, but one of relentless expectation. "It means, Commander," Ribeiro swallowed hard, "that many of the physical and digital records may not be complete. Almeida had a habit of organizing things his own way, and the previous Inspector General's office. Well, they were never very rigorous. A cold glint passed through Valeria's eyes. "I understand. That only confirms the extent of the work ahead of us. But don't worry, Lieutenant. The Inspector General's office has its own methods for unearthing what has been hidden. Not a single sheet of paper, not a single bite of information will go unexamined." She paused, looking at the door through which the last officers were leaving. "You know, Lieutenant, the hardest part of a cleanup is not removing the visible dirt, but eradicating the roots of corruption that have infiltrated the soil. And those roots often are fed by fear and complicity. Our mission now is to break that cycle." The morning sun already bathed the auditorium, revealing the dust in the corners and the wear of the seats. It was a reflection of the decadence that Valeria was there to combat. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also renewed energy. Almeida's farce was just a symptom. The disease was much deeper, and the cure would require radical surgery. While Ribeiro hurried to carry out the orders, Valeria remained for a moment in the empty auditorium. She could almost feel the residual tension in the air, the mixture of fear and hope that had filled the space. The rebuilding of trust and integrity would not be a quick or easy process. There would be resistance, there would be attempts at sabotage, there would be the pain of truth coming to light. But she was ready. The Commander General knew that every step would be watched, every decision questioned. The pressure would be immense. But the sight of the civilians in the square, the image of fear in the eyes of honest officers, and Almeida's shattered arrogance, all fueled her determination. Justice would not just be spoken, it would be done brick by brick, complaint by complaint, until the soul of that battalion was purified. The true battle had in fact only just begun. The silence in the empty auditorium was an echo of the storm that had just passed. Valeria Santiago remained there, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the clarity of purpose. The dust that the morning sun revealed was not just physical dirt. It was the accumulation of years of neglect, of dishonor. Almeida's farce was the tip of the iceberg, yes, but the disease spread through every fiber of that institution. She had no illusions. The cure would be painful, a process of disinfection that would reach every corner, every soul. While Lieutenant Ribeiro hurried to carry out the first orders, Valeria mentally traced the next steps. The arrival of the Inspector General's team would be crucial. They were not just bureaucrats, they were specialists in unraveling the hidden, in following paper and digital trails that the corrupt believed they had erased. She knew that resistance would come, not with direct confrontation, but with subtle sabotage, with the loss of files, with the failure of systems. But Valeria was prepared for each of these tactics. Ribeiro, with his brow furrowed in concentration, was already in the former commander's office, which would now be the Inspector General's headquarters. He called the IT team, the administration, feeling the suspicious glances of some colleagues passing in the corridor. The news of the intervention spread like wildfire, and with it, paranoia. Who would be next to fall? Who would speak? Who would be the informant? The air in the battalion was dense, charged with uncertainty. Hours later, the first wave of unmarked vehicles from the Inspector General's office began to arrive. They were not ostentatious patrol cars, but discreet cars from which men and women in civilian clothes descended, but with the unmistakable posture of those who held authority. They carried briefcases, laptops, forensic analysis equipment. Their presence was a physical and constant reminder that the old order was being challenged. Valeria received them at the entrance, a brief nod to each, a silent acknowledgement of the mission ahead. "Welcome, team!" Her voice was low but firm. "The task is great, but the cause is just. Lieutenant Ribeiro is already preparing the ground. I want you to start with system security and scanning all financial and operational records from the last 5 years. Nothing should be left out." The commander's office, now transformed into an improvised operations center, quickly came to life. Cables stretched, screens lit up, and the soft sound of keyboards filled the air. Lieutenant Ribeiro watched, fascinated and a little scared, the team's efficiency. They did not ask permission, they acted. Every question was direct, every instruction precise. "Lieutenant," Valeria called, pointing to a corner of the room, "this will be the confidential contact point, a secure phone, an encrypted email. I want the message to be clear. Any information, however small, is vital, and the protection of those who cooperate is our top priority." Ribeiro nodded, taking down the details for dissemination. He knew this was the riskiest step. Breaking the code of silence, the law of fear, would be like opening Pandora's box, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there were enough honest officers to turn the tide. Meanwhile, through the battalion corridors, the tension intensified. Groups of officers formed and quickly disbanded, whispers replacing open conversations. Suspicious eyes met. A sergeant, known for his loyalty to Almeida, was seen quickly emptying his drawer, throwing papers into a wastebasket before being intercepted by one of the Inspector General's agents, who, with a polite smile, asked to examine the contents. Valeria, from her new base of operations, observed everything through the security cameras that the Inspector General's team had already activated. She saw the faces, the reactions, the movements. She knew that every furtive glance, every whisper was a piece of the puzzle. Almeida's farce had been overthrown, but the network of complicity he wove was still intact, and it was this network that Valeria intended to dismantle, thread by thread. The first report arrived in less than an hour. An anonymous email, short and direct, mentioning an address and a name. Check the warehouse at Acacia Street, 123. Sergeant Silva has a side income there. Valeria read, a glint in her eyes. The door of the Inspector General's office was open, and the first voices were beginning to emerge from the silence. The battle would not only be in the archives, but in the streets, in the underworld that corruption had created. She turned to Lieutenant Ribeiro, who seemed to have aged 10 years in a few hours, but who now displayed increasing determination. Lieutenant, prepare a team for a discreet check at the mentioned address, and ensure that every step is documented. From now on, justice will not only be restored, it will be visible for all to see. Ribeiro swallowed hard. Yes, Commander, but finding trustworthy men for such a sensitive operation can be a challenge. Valeria nodded, understanding the difficulty. I know, Lieutenant, but it is essential that this first action is impeccable. Choose those you know have nothing to lose and everything to gain from restoring the honor of this battalion. And if there aren't enough men, I will go myself. The implicit threat in Valeria's last sentence was clear. Ribeiro knew he could not fail. He left the room, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a new wave of courage. He needed to find the right team. In less than 30 minutes, he returned with 3 names, 2 young, newly trained and idealistic soldiers, and an experienced sergeant, known for her unwavering integrity, but who had been marginalized by Almeida. Excellent, Lieutenant, Valeria approved, a slight smile on her lips. Instruct them to act with maximum discretion. No uniforms, no ostentatious patrol cars. I want photos, videos, everything that proves the complaint. And if caught in the act, Sergeant Silva should be detained and brought immediately here into the custody of the Inspector General's office. No stop at the local police station. Ribeiro's team left in an unmarked car, the tension palpable in the air. Meanwhile, in the commander's office, the Inspector General's agents worked non-stop. One of them, a forensic accountant, caught Valeria's attention. Commander, we found significant irregularities in fuel purchase records. There's a pattern of diversion that suggests a well-organized network, and the amounts are extremely high. Valeria approached the screen, where graphs and numbers flashed in red. Keep investigating. I want names, dates, amounts, and cross-reference with patrol and vehicle logs. I want to know who is profiting from this. Night began to fall, but the pace of work at the Inspector General's headquarters only increased. The secure phone rang again, and another anonymous email arrived. Pandora's box was open, and the complaints began to pour in. Each new piece of information was a thread to be pulled, revealing the complex web of corruption that had suffocated the battalion for so long. Hours later, an encrypted radio call. It was Ribeiro. Commander, we are on site. The warehouse is active. There's suspicious movement. We've confirmed Sergeant Silva's presence, and we found something else. It appears to be a storage point for illegal weapons. Valeria felt a shiver, Sergeant Silver's side income was much more serious than a simple diversion of goods. "Ribeiro, hold your position. Do not enter. Inspector General's reinforcements are en route. I want all involved captured and the locations sealed for forensics. This is not just a matter of corruption, it's a matter of public safety." Valeria's voice, though firm, carried the weight of the discovery. Illegal weapons. It wasn't just embezzlement or bribery. It was a large-scale criminal operation, operating under the guise of the uniform. The night, which already promised to be long, now stretched out like an abyss of uncertainties and dangers. In the improvised headquarters, the Inspector General's team reacted with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. In minutes, a tactical team, composed of elite agents trained for high-risk situations, was already deploying. They weren't just auditors. They were combatants, prepared for the confrontation that corruption, in its most advanced stage, inevitably brought. Valeria monitored every movement, every coordinate, feeling the adrenaline rise. Discretion was vital, but her team's safety was paramount. On Acacia Street 123, Lieutenant Ribeiro and his small team held their position, hidden in the darkness of the early morning. The warehouse, an innocuous-looking industrial shed, pulsed with subtle but constant activity. Shadows moved. The faint light of flashlights flickered. Sergeant Silver, a corpulent man with a scowling face, was visible through a crack, gesturing to other individuals not in uniform. The smell of metal and gunpowder seemed to emanate from the place, even at a distance. The tension was palpable, every second an eternity. The two young soldiers, though idealistic, trembled slightly, but the experienced sergeant with eagle eyes kept them focused. Then, the silence of the night was broken by a calculated movement. Unmarked vehicles from the Inspector General's office, almost invisible in the gloom, converged on the warehouse. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the silent and relentless arrival of justice. In a blink of an eye, the tactical team, in dark attire and heavy weaponry, burst from anonymity. "Inspector General's office. Hands on your head. Nobody move." The leader's grave voice echoed, amplified by the megaphone. Chaos erupted inside the shed. Shouts, the sound of falling objects, and a brief but intense confrontation. Sergeant Silver, caught by surprise, tried to react, but was quickly subdued by the agent's precision and strength. 3 other individuals, civilians, were also immobilized. Resistance was minimal, crushed by tactical superiority and the element of surprise. Ribeiro and his team, now visible, assisted in sweeping the location. What they found exceeded Valeria's darkest expectations. It wasn't just illegal weapons, it was an arsenal. Assault rifles, large-caliber pistols, ammunition in boxes stacked to the ceiling. But most shocking were the plastic explosives, detonators, and even some grenade launchers. This wasn't just for side income, it was to supply a war. In a dark corner, under a tarp, they discovered boxes of documents, sales records, accounting spreadsheets, names, dates, and amounts. These were the missing links, the web that connected Sergeant Silver not only to arms dealing, but to a network of diversion of military material that likely came from within the battalion itself. There was also a smaller, locked room, which, once forced open, revealed a clandestine monitoring center with encrypted communication radios and computers. Valeria received the report in real time, the images of the location being transmitted to the screen in front of her. The glint in her eyes was now one of contained fury. "This is much bigger than we imagined," she murmured to herself, her voice almost inaudible. "It's not just corruption, it's treason. Treason to the uniform, to the nation." Sergeant Silver, handcuffed and visibly shaken, was taken into direct custody to the headquarters, avoiding any stop that could compromise the investigation. His arrival caused a silent uproar in the battalion. Whispers turned into open murmurs, suspicious glances into panic. Silver's fall, a man many considered untouchable, was an earthquake shaking the structures of complacency. Back at the operations center, Valeria ordered the Inspector General's forensic team to immediately go to the warehouse to collect all evidence, seal the location, and begin an in-depth analysis of the documents and equipment found. I want every number, every name, every transaction. I want to know who is behind this, who is financing, who is profiting from the disgrace of this institution, she instructed, her voice low but laden with authority. The forensic accountant, who had previously warned about the fuel diversion, now had a glint of recognition in his eyes. "Commander, the names that appear in these arms records. Some of them have already come up in our investigations into the fuel. It seems the same network is involved in both schemes, and the amounts are astronomical. This funds much more than a sergeant's side income." Valeria nodded, the final piece of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Almeida's farce was just the tip of a dirty ice floe, but the entire iceberg was a mountain of crimes that extended far beyond the battalion's walls. The discovery of the arsenal and the connection to the fuel diversion network elevated the investigation to a new level of urgency and danger. The secure phone rang again. Another anonymous email arrived. Pandora's box was indeed open, and the complaints now poured in like a torrent, fueled by fear and perhaps by a new hope. The night promised to be long, but with each revelation, Valeria felt that purification, however painful, was one step closer. The true battle had only just begun, and with each passing hour, it became more complex, more dangerous, and more urgent. The early morning advanced, but the darkness outside seemed to have also settled within the walls of the improvised headquarters. The arrival of Sergeant Silver, handcuffed and escorted by Inspector General's agents, was not a discreet event despite all efforts. The buzz spread like wildfire, turning tension into silent panic. Curious and frightened eyes followed the convoy, each whisper another brick in the wall of fear that was rising. The fall of a man considered untouchable was an earthquake, and its aftershocks were beginning to be felt by everyone. Valeria observed the scene from her office. Silver's image, once arrogant, now bowed under the weight of defeat, etched in her mind. But there was no satisfaction in her gaze, only a cold, calculating determination. The purification she sought would be painful, and Silver was just the first knot to be untied. In the interrogation room, the atmosphere was sterile, lit by a cold light that hid nothing. Silver, seated at the metal table, seemed smaller, his strong man posture crumbling with each passing second. Valeria entered, accompanied by Lieutenant Ribeiro, who, despite his exhaustion, displayed new confidence. She didn't need shouts or threats. Her presence alone was a declaration of power. "Sergeant Silver," Valeria began, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You were caught red-handed. An arsenal of illegal weapons, explosives, a clandestine monitoring center. There's no denying what we found." Silver looked up, a mix of defiance and despair in his eyes. "I don't know what the commander is talking about. I was just storing some things for a friend, a favor." Valeria smiled, a humorless smile. "A favor that involves assault rifles, grenade launchers, and tons of ammunition? A favor that connects to a fuel diversion network that has been bleeding this battalion for years? Don't underestimate me, Sergeant, nor the intelligence of the Inspector General's office." While Valeria confronted Silver, the forensic team worked tirelessly at the warehouse on Acacia Street. Every box of ammunition was catalogued, every weapon photographed, every document scanned. The computers from the clandestine monitoring center were taken to headquarters, where Inspector General's cybersecurity specialists were already diving into their encrypted systems. "Commander," the forensic accounting specialist called Valeria back to her office, his eyes gleaming with the adrenaline of discovery. "The warehouse records are a map, We found detailed sales and purchase spreadsheets, and the names, they repeat. The same individuals who received the diverted fuel now appear as arms buyers. It's the same network, Commander, but the most shocking thing is the final destination of some of these weapons. He pointed to the screen, where a list of names and codes flickered. Some transactions indicate that military material, including precision rifles and ballistic vests restricted to the armed forces, was sold to paramilitary groups in border regions. And the payments are made through offshore accounts. We're talking millions. This isn't side income, Commander. It's an international trafficking operation. Valeria felt her stomach churn. The scale of the betrayal was unimaginable. It wasn't just internal corruption. It was a threat to national security, funded with public money, and operated under the guise of the uniform. And the warehouse documents, the specialist continued. There are mentions of a Project Alpha. It seems to be a larger scheme involving the diversion of communication equipment and surveillance technology, and Captain Almeida's name appears in some of these documents, Commander, not directly as a buyer or seller, but as a facilitator, someone who guarantees logistics or grants access. The mention of Almeida ignited a flame in Valeria's eyes. The man who tried to handcuff her for contempt was more than an abusive captain. He was a key piece, perhaps one of the pillars, of a criminal network that extended far beyond the battalion. The irony was bitter. He had tried to silence her, without knowing that he was only accelerating his own downfall. In the interrogation, Silva, confronted with the irrefutable evidence and the mention of Almeida, finally gave in. The fear of being the only one to fall outweighed his loyalty. Almeida. He knew everything, Commander. He was the link. He cleared the fuel trucks. He gave the orders for material to disappear from stock. He has people everywhere. He has protection. Valeria's voice remained firm, but the tension in her jaw was visible. Protection from whom, Sergeant? Give me names. Give me proof. And perhaps we can consider some cooperation. Silva, his voice choked, began to pour out a torrent of information. Names of officers, dates of transactions, locations of meetings. He detailed how Almeida, with his influence and network of contacts, ensured impunity, silenced complaints, and even manipulated patrol schedules to facilitate the diversions. Almeida's farce, as Valeria had called it, was an intricate ballet of corruption, where every step was calculated to maximize profit and minimize risk. Meanwhile, the cybersecurity specialists managed to break the encryption of one of the warehouse computers. What they found was a treasure trove of information. Emails exchanged between network members, coded text messages, and, most alarmingly, a video file. The video showed Captain Almeida in uniform inspecting boxes of assault rifles in the warehouse itself, gesturing and smiling, as if on a routine weapons inspection. The image was clear, unquestionable. Valeria received the news with a sense of dread in her chest. The proof she needed to link Almeida directly to the arms trafficking network was there. The captain was not just a facilitator, he was an active participant, a traitor to the uniform he wore. The night was far from over. With each new revelation, the web of corruption became denser, more dangerous. But with each thread unraveled, Valeria felt that the truth, however dark, was finally coming to light. The battle had only just begun, but the Commander-General was ready for war. The next step would be decisive, confront Captain Almeida with the irrefutable evidence. The following morning brought no relief, but brutal clarity. Valeria ordered Captain Almeida summoned for an emergency meeting in her office, under the pretext of discussing recent complaints of fuel diversion. It was a trap, carefully set to catch him off guard, away from any of his contacts or the protection Silva had mentioned. Lieutenant Ribeiro and 2 Inspector General's agents, discreetly armed and in civilian clothes, positioned themselves strategically. The tension was palpable, a silence heavy with anticipation hung in the air. Almeida arrived punctual with his usual arrogant demeanor. A smug smile played on his lips, as if the meeting was just another formality he would dominate. He didn't know that this would be the last smile he wore with impunity. Upon entering the room, his eyes swept the environment, stopping at Valeria, seated at her desk, with an impassive expression. "Commander," he greeted, his voice polished, but with an underlying tone of defiance. "I hope this emergency meeting is truly urgent. I have a busy schedule." Valeria did not respond immediately, her eyes fixed on his, a cold intensity that made Almeida's smile falter for an instant. "Captain Almeida," she began, her voice low but with unquestionable authority. "It's more urgent than you can imagine." She gestured towards the projection screen on the wall. "Lieutenant Ribeiro, please show the captain the reason for our urgency." The image that appeared on the screen made Almeida's blood run cold. It was him in uniform in the warehouse on Acacia Street, inspecting boxes of assault rifles, gesturing, smiling. The video was clear, unquestionable. Almeida's smile collapsed, replaced by a mask of shock and disbelief. His eyes widened and he tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What is this?" he stammered, his voice failing. Valeria stood up, walking slowly until she was in front of him. "This, Captain, is irrefutable proof of your betrayal. Betrayal of the uniform, the institution, the nation. It's not just corruption, it's large-scale arms trafficking, connected to paramilitary groups and financed with money diverted from this battalion." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "Sergeant Silva has already confessed. He detailed your role as a facilitator, as the link that guaranteed logistics and granted access for the diversion of fuel and military material. He described your protection, your contacts. But not all your network of influence will be able to protect you now." Almeida's face paled. The shock turned into contained fury, but it was the fury of a cornered animal. He tried to regain composure, his eyes searching for an escape. "A denial. This is a setup, a conspiracy to bring me down. I am a loyal officer." Valeria laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Loyal? You tried to handcuff me for contempt when I was investigating your farce, Captain. You underestimated the Inspector General's office. You underestimated me. And now the farce is over." She signaled to Lieutenant Ribeiro. "Captain Almeida, you are under arrest for international arms trafficking, diversion of military material, corruption, and criminal association. Your handcuffs are waiting." The two Inspector General's agents approached, their presences imposing. Almeida tried to resist for an instant, a last glimmer of his former power, but the sight of the handcuffs, the same ones he had threatened to use against her, broke his spirit. He was handcuffed, his wrists now bound by cold metal, the image of his own failure. The arrogance completely dissolved, revealing a broken and terrified man. The fall of Captain Almeida was a milestone, but Valeria knew it was only the beginning. The network was vast, and Silva had mentioned protection at higher levels. Almeida's arrest would certainly send shockwaves through the entire corrupt structure, but it could also alert the true architects behind Project Alpha. The war was far from over, but Valeria had won a crucial battle. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, but within headquarters, the darkness of corruption still needed to be fully dispelled. The handcuff that closed on Captain Almeida's wrists resonated like a death knell in the silence of Valeria's office. It was not just the arrest of a man, but the crumbling of a facade, the first pillar to fall from a structure of corruption that seemed unshakable. Valeria watched as Almeida was escorted out, arrogance replaced by icy terror. The victory was undeniable, but the Commander-General knew it was merely the prelude to a much larger war. The rising sun, painting the sky with promises, contrasted with the darkness that still needed to be dispelled within the walls of that headquarters. The news of Captain Almeida's arrest, though kept under strict secrecy, was a ticking time bomb. Valeria knew that the protection network Silva had mentioned would be alerted. The tentacles of corruption were long and extended to levels she could not yet measure. The priority now was to extract as much information as possible from Almeida and Silva before any attempt at silencing or cover-up could be orchestrated. Almeida's interrogation began immediately, conducted by an elite Inspector General's team. Initially, he maintained a defiant posture, denying everything, claiming his rights and threatening retaliation. But the mountain of evidence, the unquestionable video, Silva's detailed confessions, the warehouse spreadsheets, the encrypted emails was overwhelming. Each denial was met with new, irrefutable proof. Each threat, with the cold reality of his situation. The pressure was relentless. Meanwhile, the cybersecurity team delved deeper into the systems found in the warehouse. Project Alpha was not just a name on documents, it was a meticulous plan. They discovered that it involved the systematic diversion of high-tech communication equipment, including state-of-the-art encrypted radios, listening systems, and surveillance drones with advanced reconnaissance capabilities. The value of this equipment was astronomical, and its use in the wrong hands posed an even greater threat than arms trafficking. "Commander," the head of the cybersecurity team, Captain Torres, informed Valeria, her voice filled with urgency. "We found more than just plans. There are test records. Project Alpha is not just an idea, it's in the implementation phase. The diverted equipment is being field-tested in border areas, and the data we recovered suggests they are being used to monitor trafficking routes, not to combat it, but to facilitate the passage of illegal cargo, including drugs and people." Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just corruption and arms trafficking. It was a network that was arming and equipping criminals, undermining national security from within. Project Alpha was a parallel intelligence operation using state resources and technology for illicit purposes, with a sophistication that shocked her. The pressure on Almeida finally took its toll. Broken by the weight of the evidence and the fear of a life sentence, he began to speak. His voice, once arrogant, was now a whisper of despair. He confirmed Project Alpha, detailing how the equipment was diverted from the battalion's inventory, often with the complicity of high-ranking officers who signed false disposal or transfer orders. "I'm not the only one, Commander," he pleaded, his eyes watering. "There are others. High-ranking officers. They are the true architects. I was just a piece, a local facilitator. They have influence, Commander. A lot of influence. They can do anything to protect themselves." He began to list names, dates, locations of secret meetings. He mentioned a general, a colonel, and even a civilian with political ties who seemed to be the link between the military network and external criminal groups. The web was more intricate and dangerous than Valeria had imagined. Almeida's contacts and protection were not mere subordinates, but powerful, untouchable figures. With each name revealed, the urgency of the situation increased. Almeida's arrest, far from being the end, was the fuse. The architects of Project Alpha would now be on high alert. Valeria knew they would not hesitate to use all their resources to silence Almeida, discredit the investigation, or worse, eliminate anyone who stood in their way. "Commander," Lieutenant Ribeiro entered the office, his face pale. "We received an anonymous tip, a leak of information about your investigation. It seems someone is trying to discredit the Inspector General's office, suggesting we are acting for political motives, fabricating evidence." Valeria felt the adrenaline pump. It was the reaction she expected, but the speed with which it came caught her by surprise. The network was moving, trying to counterattack. They were trying to turn the tables, turning her from investigator into target. "Prepare a press conference immediately, Lieutenant," Valeria ordered, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with determination. "We won't wait for them to attack us. We will expose the truth. We will show the country the extent of this betrayal. And we will ensure that Captain Almeida and Sergeant Silva are under the strictest protection. They are our bridge to the true culprits." The war had escalated. It was no longer a secret operation, but a public battle for truth and justice. Valeria knew she was about to face the darkest and most powerful forces within the very institution she swore to protect. But she was ready. The farce had ended, and the Commander-General was determined to dismantle every piece of that network of betrayal. No matter how high the names involved might be, the next step would be a direct confrontation, not just with the criminals, but with the system that protected them. Valeria's order echoed in the office, charged with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. A press conference. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a declaration of open war, a leap into the abyss of uncertainty, where truth would be the only weapon against an invisible yet omnipresent enemy. Lieutenant Ribeiro, though pale, nodded with the determination of a loyal soldier. The Inspector General's machinery, previously operating in the shadows, now prepared to emerge under the most intense spotlights. As the communication team mobilized with lightning speed, Valeria reviewed the documents, the confessions, the videos. Every piece of evidence was a brick in the wall she was building against corruption, but also a target on her back. The anonymous tip, the leak, was the first arrow shot by the architects. They were trying to divert attention, discredit, sow doubt, but Valeria would not give them that victory. "Commander, the press is in an uproar," Ribeiro informed, the phone still hot in his hands. "Social media is exploding with accusations against the Inspector General's office. They're trying to paint you as a political figure, using the institution for personal gain." Valeria pressed her lips together. It was exactly what she expected, the classic tactic of disinformation. But she had an ace up her sleeve, one they didn't expect. "Let them talk. Lieutenant, the truth will be our answer. Ensure that Almeida and Silva are in maximum security cells with 24-hour surveillance. No one, absolutely no one, can have access to them without my express authorization." The security of the two men was paramount. They were the key witnesses, the weakest links in the chain, but also the most valuable. If they were silenced, the investigation could collapse, and the true culprits would escape unpunished. Valeria felt the weight of responsibility, not only for the operation, but for the lives of her men and the integrity of the institution. The press room at headquarters, usually used for routine announcements, was transformed into a battleground. Television cameras, microphones from all broadcasters, reporters with hungry eyes for a story. The tension was palpable, an electric hum in the air. Valeria, in her dress uniform, walked to the podium, her posture erect, her gaze firm. There was no hesitation, no fear. Only the unwavering determination of a commander-general who had sworn to protect the nation. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice resonating with clarity and authority, silencing the buzz. "I am here today to address the recent unfounded allegations circulating about the Inspector General's office and myself. Allegations that seek to divert attention from a much darker and more dangerous truth." She paused dramatically, allowing her words to sink in. "In recent months, the Inspector General's office has conducted an exhaustive investigation into a network of corruption and betrayal that has infiltrated the highest echelons of this institution. A network that not only diverted resources but compromised national security, arming and equipping criminal groups. Shock rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged glances, some already typing frantically on their laptops. Valeria did not reveal names or details that could compromise the ongoing investigation, but she presented irrefutable evidence of Captain Almeida's arrest, the arms trafficking, the diversion of high-tech equipment from Project Alpha. She displayed edited excerpts of the video of Almeida in the warehouse without revealing Silva's identity, protecting her source. "Captain Almeida," she declared, his handcuffed image appearing on the big screen, "was arrested for international arms trafficking, diversion of military material, corruption and criminal association. He is one piece, but not the only one, of a much larger web, a web that, as he himself confessed, involves high-ranking officers and figures with political connections." The room erupted with questions. Valeria, however, maintained control. "I will not speculate on names at this moment. The investigation is ongoing and will be pursued to its fullest extent. But I want to make it clear, we will not tolerate betrayal. We will not allow the uniform we wear to be stained by those who should protect it." She looked directly at the cameras, at the country watching. "Those who try to discredit us, those who try to sow discord and disinformation, are the same ones who benefit from this corruption. They fear the truth. But the truth, my friends, is an unstoppable force. And I, as Commander General, swear that it will prevail." The press conference was an earthquake. The next day's headlines blared the news of Almeida's arrest and Valeria's strong statements. Public opinion, previously confused by anonymous tips, now turned against the corruption network. But Valeria knew the battle was far from over. Public exposure was a double-edged sword. She had gained the support of the people, but she had also become the primary target. In the silence of her office, Valeria turned on the news. The face of a general, one of the names mentioned by Almeida, appeared on the screen, vehemently denying any involvement, demanding justice and threatening to sue the Inspector General's office. The war had escalated to a personal and dangerous level. The architects were revealing themselves, and direct confrontation was imminent. Valeria felt a shiver, but not of fear. It was the adrenaline of battle, the certainty that she was on the right path. The farce had collapsed, but the true fight was just beginning. Valeria's press conference reverberated like thunder in a clear sky, shaking the foundations of power. The next day's headlines were a whirlwind of indignation and speculation. "Commander General accuses military high command of treason." Project Alpha. The corruption network threatening the nation. General denies involvement and threatens to sue Inspector General's office. The country was in shock, divided between believing the Commander General's word and the incredulity that such betrayal could come from within. The general, whose face Valeria had seen on television, wasted no time. Hours after the press conference, an official statement from his office was issued, describing Valeria's accusations as frivolous, unfounded, and motivated by personal political ambitions. The statement demanded an immediate investigation into the Commander General's conduct, suggesting she was using the Inspector General's office as a tool to destabilize the hierarchy and gain advantages. It was an orchestrated, precise, and brutal counterattack. "Commander, the Office of the President of the Republic has requested an emergency meeting," Lieutenant Ribeiro informed, his voice tense. "It seems the pressure is coming from all sides. The general has powerful allies." Valeria nodded, her gaze fixed on the computer screen, where a complex map of the corruption network was being drawn. Each line, each name, was a thread in the web she was unraveling. She knew the meeting would not be a dialogue, but an interrogation, an attempt to delegitimize her investigation before it could advance further. "Prepare all documents, Lieutenant. Every piece of evidence, every confession, every detail of Project Alpha. We will leave no room for doubt." As she prepared for the political confrontation, the cybersecurity team worked tirelessly. Almeida's information, combined with the recovered data, was opening new fronts. Commander, the head of the team, Captain Torres, called Valeria, her voice vibrating with the discovery. "We found something. The test records for Project Alpha are not just in border areas. There's a pattern. They are concentrated on specific routes, used for the smuggling of a very particular type of rare earth mineral, a mineral that is essential for the manufacture of high-tech electronic components." Valeria felt a chill down her spine. It wasn't just drug and arms trafficking. It was something much bigger with economic and strategic implications, the rare earth mineral. This explained the sophistication and the involvement of such powerful figures. It wasn't just money, it was geopolitical power. "This mineral," Valeria murmured, "what kind of technology is it used in?" "Mainly in encrypted communication systems and in precision missile components, Commander," Torres replied, her eyes wide. "It's a strategic material, highly controlled. Mass diversion would be a blow to national security and a huge advantage for whoever possessed it." The revelation added a layer of gravity to the situation. Project Alpha was not just a parallel intelligence operation to facilitate crime. It was a network for the extraction and trafficking of strategic resources, undermining the country's own defense capabilities. The architects were not just corrupt, they were traitors of an unthinkable magnitude. The meeting in the president's office was tense. Valeria, alone against a panel of generals, ministers, and advisors, presented her evidence with her characteristic calm and authority. She detailed the arms trafficking, the equipment diversion, Almeida's confession, and for the first time, the discovery of the rare earth mineral trafficking and its implications. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the clicking of pens and the whispers of some present. The general, present at the meeting, maintained an impassive posture, vehemently denying everything, accusing Valeria of exceeding her authority and creating a fantastical narrative to justify a personal vendetta. He demanded the immediate suspension of the Commander-General and the opening of a military inquiry against her. "Commander Valeria," the President finally spoke, his voice heavy with concern, "the accusations are serious from both sides. We cannot allow the institution to be destabilized by an internal dispute. I suggest the investigation be transferred to a special committee with external oversight." Valeria sensed the maneuver. It was an attempt to take control of the investigation out of her hands, to dilute the power of the Inspector General's office, to bury the truth under bureaucracy. But she was prepared. "Mr. President," she replied, her voice firm, "with all due respect, the Inspector General's office already possesses irrefutable evidence. Transferring the investigation now would give the culprits time to destroy evidence and silence witnesses. If my integrity is in question, I am ready to face any inquiry, but I will not relinquish my responsibility to see this investigation through to the end. National security is at stake, and the truth cannot be negotiated." She looked directly at the general, who met her gaze with calculated coldness. The war had become a duel of wills, a battle for the soul of the institution. Valeria knew that from that moment on, she was not just fighting criminals, but the very system they had corrupted. The farce had ended, and the Commander-General was alone, but not defeated, in the eye of a perfect storm. The next step would be the most dangerous of all, for she knew that the architects would not hesitate to use any means to stop her. The silence that followed her refusal echoed louder than any shout. Valeria felt the heavy glances, the veiled disapproval, the disguised surprise. To the president, she had been insolent. To the generals loyal to the system, a threat. To the general who accused her, an adversary to be crushed. But for Valeria, it was the only possible answer. To hand over the investigation now would be to sign the death warrant of truth. It would be to allow darkness to swallow the light she fought to ignite. She left the presidential office with the feeling of having crossed a point of no return. The storm was no longer a distant threat. She was in the eye of the hurricane. The walls of power, once protective, now seemed to close around her. She was not just fighting criminals, but a hydra of corruption that had rooted so deeply that the institution itself seemed to defend its parasites. "Commander, there's an order from the President's office," Lieutenant Ribeiro informed, his voice low, almost a whisper as soon as she returned to her improvised headquarters. "All Inspector General's operations have been suspended for 48 hours for a procedure reassessment, and your cybersecurity team has been reallocated to priority tasks." Valeria felt the blow. It was the architect's first move, to cut off her arms, blind her eyes, to isolate her. "And Captain Torres and her team?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of steel. "They've been transferred to the Border Intelligence Division, Commander, with immediate effect." A bitter smile curled Valeria's lips. They were acting fast. They wanted to dismantle her structure, prevent her from advancing with the discoveries about the rare earth mineral, but they underestimated her determination. "Lieutenant Ribeiro," she said, turning to him, her gaze penetrating, "are you with me?" Ribeiro didn't hesitate. "To the end, Commander." "Good. Then prepare yourself. We will operate in the shadows. We can't trust anyone but ourselves now. Use the secure lines we established. Contact Agent Silva. Tell him the situation has escalated. He needs to be on high alert. And prepare a plan for me to access the raw data of Project Alpha without the cybersecurity team." Night fell over the city, but for Valeria, the battle was just beginning. She knew that the general and his allies would not be content with merely suspending her operations. The next move would be more personal, more dangerous. They would try to demoralize her, defame her, perhaps even eliminate her. In the silence of her office, Valeria mentally reviewed every detail of the investigation. The rare earth mineral. Project Alpha was not just a facade for arms trafficking. It was an operation for the extraction and diversion of a vital strategic resource. This explained the ferocity of the architect's reaction. They were protecting an empire, not just a network of corruption. She remembered Almeida's confession, the whispered names, the political connections. The general was just the tip of the iceberg, but he was the most visible and dangerous tip at the moment. He was the shield, the spokesperson for the farce. Valeria picked up a small voice recorder from her drawer. "Personal log," she began, her voice firm. "Date, current date. Time, current time. Following the meeting with the president, my operations have been suspended and my cybersecurity team reallocated. This confirms my suspicion that the architects are acting to neutralize me. The integrity of the investigation and my own safety are compromised. However, I will not back down. I have crucial information about the diversion of rare earth mineral, a strategic material that compromises national security. My next action will be..." She paused, her eyes fixed on a tactical map on the wall where she had marked the extraction points and smuggling routes of the mineral. The pattern was clear. They were using the Project Alpha infrastructure to move the material, and there was a name that kept surfacing in intelligence reports, a name linked to shell companies and an obscure logistics network. A name Almeida had mentioned in passing, almost reverently: Senator Vargas. Vargas was an influential politician with deep connections in the mining and defense sectors. If he was involved, the scale of the conspiracy would be even greater than she imagined. He was not a military man, but one of the true masterminds behind the operation. "My next action will be to investigate Senator Vargas." Valeria continued on the recorder. "He appears to be the piece that connects the military network with the civilian sector and the international market for strategic minerals. This is a high-risk operation. If I fail, the truth could be buried forever. But if I succeed, we will unmask the true traitors. She turned off the recorder, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. The suspension of her operations was not an obstacle, but a warning. They wanted her out of the game. But Valeria was not one to back down. She was the Commander General, and she had sworn to protect the nation. And sometimes protecting the nation meant going against those who hid in the shadows of power, even if it meant becoming a solitary target in the darkness. The next step would be the most dangerous, for she knew that to bring down an empire, sometimes one had to burn bridges and march alone into battle. Night swallowed the city, but for Valeria, darkness was an ally. The suspension of her operations was not an end, but an invitation to clandestinity. The game had changed, and now the rules were hers. With Ribeiro by her side and Silva operating in the shadows, the Commander General transformed into an even more dangerous shadow for those who underestimated her. "Lieutenant," Valeria whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the improvised headquarters, a subterranean bunker she had prepared for emergencies. "We need a secure access point to the Project Alpha servers. Something Captain Torres and her team wouldn't have used, a backdoor that only the architects would know." Ribeiro, a computer genius disguised as a logistics officer, nodded, his eyes fixed on a screen displaying complex diagrams. "Commander, maintenance records reveal a remote access terminal at an old deactivated base near the border. It was used for field tests of Project Alpha. It's a direct line, without the firewalls they put up to block us." "Perfect," Valeria murmured, a plan forming in her mind. "Silva, are you ready for an infiltration?" On the other end of the secure line, Silva's voice was calm, but with an edge of anticipation. "Always, Commander. Where and when?" "Base Delta 7, tomorrow night. You will access the terminal and download everything. Ribeiro, you will provide remote support. I will be on site, ensuring security." The risk was immense. Valeria would be placing herself directly in the sights of the architects, in territory where they exercised absolute control. But she knew there was no other way. Time was running out, and with each passing hour, Senator Vargas and his accomplices could be destroying more evidence. The infiltration of Base Delta 7 was a silent dance with danger. Darkness was her veil, the wind her accomplice. Valeria, dressed in light tactical gear, moved with the precision of a predator, her senses sharpened, every shadow a potential enemy. Silva, a ghost among the ruins, reached the terminal. In minutes, Ribeiro, miles away, was navigating the raw data. "Commander," Ribeiro's voice came through the communicator, tense. "It's even worse than we imagined. The records aren't just about mineral diversion. There are sales contracts to foreign powers with exclusivity clauses and payments to offshore accounts. And Vargas's name appears in each of them, not as an intermediary, but as the main beneficiary and orchestrator." Valeria felt a knot in her stomach. Treason in its purest and most devastating form. Senator Vargas was not just corrupt, he was selling national security. "There's more, Commander," Ribeiro continued, his voice almost a lament. "The field tests of Project Alpha weren't just to divert minerals. They were testing the transport and camouflage capabilities of strategic cargo, including missile warheads. The rare earth mineral was just the tip of the iceberg. They were building a logistics network to traffic weapons of mass destruction." The air seemed to thin. Valeria closed her eyes for an instant, the gravity of the discovery weighing on her. It wasn't just corruption, it was an existential threat. The general wasn't just corrupt. He was a traitor who allowed the country to be disarmed and its secrets sold. "Silva, do you have everything?" Valeria asked, her voice firm despite the shock. "Download complete, Commander. I'm leaving." On the way back, the sense of urgency was palpable. They had the evidence. Now they needed to use it before they were silenced forever. Valeria knew that the suspension of her operations was just the first step. The next would be the attempt to eliminate her. They took refuge in a secure location, an isolated country house, far from any surveillance. Ribeiro worked tirelessly, organizing the data, creating an irrefutable presentation. The evidence was overwhelming. Encrypted communications between Vargas and the general, detailed financial records, smuggling routes, even videos of missile tests in remote areas. "Commander," Ribeiro said, his eyes red with fatigue, but with a glint of triumph. "It's all here. There's no denying it." Valeria looked at the screen, where the general's impassive face and Senator Vargas's smiling image alternated, linked by a web of betrayal. "It's time to end the farce," she declared, her voice filled with cold determination. She knew she couldn't go to the president again. He had already tried to neutralize her. She needed a bigger stage, one where the truth couldn't be stifled. The National Congress. The next morning, Valeria, out of uniform, but with the authority of one who carried the weight of truth, appeared by surprise at an extraordinary session of Congress, convened to discuss the national security crisis and the improper conduct of the Commander General. The general was there, seated in the front row, with a sneer. Senator Vargas, in his seat of power, seemed calm, confident in his impunity. "Ladies and gentlemen of Congress," Valeria began, her voice echoing through the hall, "I have been accused of exceeding my authority and creating a fantastical narrative. My operations have been suspended, but the truth, as always, finds its way." She projected the evidence. The faces in the room went from skepticism to shock, and then to fury. The images of the missiles, the sales contracts, the offshore accounts, all exposed in brutal detail. The names of Senator Vargas and the general, unequivocally linked to treason. The general stood up, pale, but still trying to maintain his composure. "This is a farce. Fabricated evidence. This woman is destabilizing the country." Valeria stared at him, her eyes blue as ice. "General, the only farce here is yours, and it's about to end." Suddenly, a group of officers, loyal to the general, stormed the plenary. "Commander Valeria, you are under arrest for insubordination and treason," a captain shouted, drawing handcuffs. The silence was absolute. Valeria, surrounded, remained motionless. She looked at the captain, then at the general, who watched with a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Captain," Valeria said, her voice low but resonating with unquestionable authority, "do you really think you can handcuff the Commander General of the Armed Forces, the military magistrate who came to end your farce?" She then made a discreet signal. Suddenly the doors of the plenary opened again. This time, they were not the general's men. They were federal police agents and Inspector General's agents, led by Agent Silva, all with arrest warrants in hand. They had been activated by Valeria through a secret channel, a contingency she had prepared in case she was cornered. The general's smile vanished. Senator Vargas tried to flee but was intercepted. The captain who tried to handcuff her lowered his hands, his face contorted in shock and humiliation. He had underestimated the woman in front of him, the Commander General who had seen through all their lies. "General," Valeria said, her voice now filled with sorrow, "you swore to protect this nation. Instead, you sold it. Your handcuffs are not for me, but for you." The farce was over. The architects were unmasked. The general and Senator Vargas were taken into custody, their careers and lives in ruins. Project Alpha was dismantled, and the network of trafficking in rare earth minerals and weapons of mass destruction exposed and neutralized. Valeria watched as justice, slow but relentless, began to act. She was no longer alone. The nation, shocked but now aware of the truth, was with her. The storm had passed, leaving behind a trail of destruction, but also the promise of a new dawn. The Commander General had fulfilled her mission. She had protected the nation not with weapons, but with truth, and had proved that in the end, integrity always prevails over corruption. The war had been won, and the soul of the institution redeemed.